Hello there, John Cuturillo here. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Your Listener podcast. Today I have an incredibly special guest to welcome. It's my absolute pleasure. But just before I do that, I'm going to remind our audience that if you have concerns for yourself or someone else that may be raised by anything that we discuss in this episode or elsewhere, please do not take anything that you find on the internet or in the media as advice. Please seek advice from a professional or from someone you trust. Now, today it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Susanne Gervay. Susanne, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to see you.
It's a pleasure for me too.
Susanne, we have a lot to discuss today. For reasons that we're going to introduce in just a moment, we're going to be talking about how children can be a force for good in the world and how society operates. But before we get to that, there's some information that I don't want the audience to miss, given its importance in the work that you do. So would you like to tell us a bit about yourself? I understand that you have a rich history. You come from a migrant background. You're an author, you're a teacher, you're a consultant, you're a lecturer. You've seen a lot of your own challenges and bounced right back with incredible resilience, and you've worked around the world for various movements involving justice and well-being. Where would you like to start? Tell us, who is Susanne?
Who is me? Me is complicated like all of you. And my background is that my parents were Hungarian refugees and they came to Australia after horrendous experience with Nazism and communism. They escaped, they went to refugee camp, and they had the courage to come to this country. And they waited about a year in the camp until they were chosen. And they came to this country. One of the things I learned from my parents is courage and resilience, even though times were really hard. They started off their life in Australia in a boarding house in one room, and the family stayed there, which included grandma, mum, dad, and my little brother. But something wonderful happened. The sparkle in my dad's eye arrived. That was me. I don't know how happy they were, but I did come onto this earth and I just made it as an Australian, which made me very happy. My parents always said Australia is the best country in the world because we have freedom, because no one will knock on my parents' door and take them away to a gulag, to prison, to forced labour. They know they had a chance for rebuilding. And that's what drives every single thing I write. The drive to rebuild, to believe in your children, to know they can impact on this world. I received an Order of Australia. When I received it, I couldn't believe it, and it said, do not tell anyone. And of course I wouldn't tell anyone because I thought it was a mistake. I expected another letter saying, error. No, I got this amazing Order of Australia for my work in children's literature and literature generally. And when I got it at the beautiful government house by Marie Bashir, the governor then, and I just admire her so much, I got it obviously because, I've worked in children's literature and social justice. But really, I got it for my amazing parents and their courage to build a new life here. But more importantly, I got it for every person who makes home in this land, for the many migrants, and for our own people, our original Indigenous population. They made home here, and that is why I received it with enormous gratitude and disbelief. And since then, I've written 18 books, and I've done it in between life. My tragedy, it is a bit of a tragedy, is I'm always in chaos. Something happens. I've had breast cancer in my 30s, 40s, 50s. Okay. Then I had a massive tumor, which was a whole year of recovery. Recently, and I have won this battle, I had 2 brain tumors and a stroke, and I was left with feeding tubes and all the rest, and completely aphasic. I could not speak, write, read, nothing at all. My speech center had been attacked by the brain tumor, and I got a stroke when a surgeon removed it. Now, I was sitting there on the bed. I couldn't sit up. I couldn't walk. The stroke had been on my left side, but it affected my right. And I was determined. Am I going to stay in this bed and die? A lot of the other people did. They just stayed there, lying in their bed, and they would end up in a nursing home, says the physiotherapists and the doctors. Not me. I worked and worked and worked, and it was so hard to get my words out, to do the endless occupational therapy. But you know what? I made it. I've still got some problems, and you may not see it, but I do. A new speech center developed in my brain, and my words came back after 2 years, and now I'm speaking and doing as I wish. It's a bit harder, but not as hard as giving up, not as hard as my parents facing communism and Nazism, not as hard as the challenges so many people face. So I am inspired to give hope to kids. It means everything to me. Kids are so smart. They know everything, but they don't know how to define it, how to process it. When I write, I hold their hand and I travel with them. And I hope they find the gems that will give them courage to go on, because sometimes it's really hard.
Susan, what an inspiration, and something that I'm constantly discussing, and this is one of the reasons why I love to hear these stories from people, is that no matter how difficult life gets, unfortunately, sometimes the only way to actually see the other side of it is to suffer through it and push and push and push as hard as you can. But if there's any chance of survival sometimes, that's the only way forward. But that's what I encourage people to do. Think about what could be on the other side of all that pushing. That's amongst a number of different achievements that you've made, and we're going to speak to another one of them. And to introduce that achievement, I'd like to also make some public acknowledgement of the Mabusta movement, and we're going to explain how Susan and the Mabusta movement came to be associated with each other. The Mabusta movement is an organization and an initiative that operates in Italy, and it was started in 2016 when an Italian school student attempted to take their own life following experiences of being bullied. And since then, the movement has grown. It has a number of members, both academic, adults, school children as well. And it's developed both an ethos and a protocol for teaching schools, school-wide, and also individual students what they can do about bullying, how they can act with each other and be an ally, but also how they can teach the bullies themselves to change their behaviours. And Susan, you came to be connected with the Mabusta movement because one of your most well-known books in Australia, what is essentially now an anti-bullying classic in our wonderful country, I Am Jack, was translated into Italian in aid of that. Congratulations! How did that come about?
I was so thrilled. I couldn't believe it. I got an email, and Daniel, Professor Daniel Manny, and Elizabeth said to me, "We have read Jack and we love it. Can we translate it?" And I thought, yes, of course. And I sent it off to my publisher at HarperCollins, and they did whatever, but I didn't understand what they were really doing. But once I began talking to them, they were the most wonderful organisation. They empowered kids to act, to talk to other kids, to inspire them to stand beside their friends and others, to help kids who use aggression to see a different way. And the young man who was the initiator of this actually met the Pope and the President of Italy, and I cheered. And it's going all around Italy as a non-profit free program for every child, and it is initiated by the young people but supported by the academics, and it's a perfect mix. I was so excited because I Am Jack has been around, I dare not say it, but 25 years, and it's become part of the curriculum, part of most school programs. And even though it's a bit older, it carries the same message that kids don't understand how they get in trouble. They don't understand why something sparks a bullying reaction, and then they have to organise how to deal with it. And my Jack, because it's based on my son, he organised, he was brave, he went to the library and learnt karate, but he couldn't karate the whole school. Okay, he thought of other techniques like sick days, except his mother didn't believe it every time he had a sick day. He developed strategies such as hiding, finding solace by going to the beach, and his grandfather, who had passed away, would come beside him, and he said, "I'll always am beside you." He learnt the ways to survive, and they were all inadequate. He needed his mother, his sister, the classmates, his school to stand beside him, because he is a hero and he made change in the world. I asked him before I wrote it, can I write this book? And my beautiful son says, yes, Mum, because kids get bullied, other kids bully them, and I want to help all the kids of the world. And I then hugged him, of course. It has changed the world. There's 3 other books following I Am Jack about really my life, things when I get breast cancer, his best friend who is Vietnamese, looking for his father, all the stuff of life. And we don't realize that kids face this every day. And you know what? Books are their secret way to find some answers to go on.
Again, Susan, I have to congratulate you. I'm showing my age that it's been a while since I was familiar with the school curriculum, but the reason that this brings together what we're discussing is that I Am Jack was actually how I discovered you. I remember when I was approximately 9 years of age, my mother introduced me to the book because I myself was being bullied at school. And we won't spoil too much of it, but I Am Jack is about a schoolboy who is learning to address different aspects of growing up in the world. He's learning to adapt to his new family dynamics, his mother having a new partner. He's learning to adapt to his aging grandmother and working with her as she moves into her senior years. And he also starts to experience bullying at school, and nobody seems to want to listen until one day he decides, I need to do something and I need people to stand beside me. And so he takes a stand and people finally listen.
When kids stand beside Jack, I don't expect them to stand up in class and sprout it's not Jack's fault, this is happening, that. No, it's scary to stand up. But to stand up by being a friend, privately, by getting involved in Jack, he knows he has other people. And let me say, as an adult, I am scared to stand up often. And it's not because I don't care. I do care. But I know there are ways to stand up. When everyone is away, go beside your friend. So he knows he is not alone.
Absolutely. And you've also written a range of different other works. You've written picture books, you've written stories for young adults and teenagers as well. And I understand that all of them have that theme that you were discussing, resilience and learning to make your place in the world, but also how love and persistence can help to overcome even the most intensive of challenges. When I was perusing what you'd done, there was one title in particular that stood out to me, and you were telling me just before we began today that it was a story inspired by how your own daughter's life was saved by Eminem. Would you like to tell us that story before we move on to today's topic?
My daughter really was very crushed by the world at about 15. I had had cancer for the second time. By the way, I'd never, ever remember this. She told me now as an adult. When I came home, I talked to her about that I had cancer again. And I said to her, and I'm going to die. I don't remember saying that. How traumatizing is that? And my daughter felt bereft. I mean, we were divorced. There was my son, and she absolutely became passionate about M. And people think, oh, he uses swear words, this and that. No, my daughter said, I love him because he grew up in a black neighborhood in a trailer. He was white trash, and he decided he would empower the world. He made his music. He fought the battles. And he is one of the great rap artists of the world. And my daughter's room were covered with his huge posters. And she listened to his music endlessly because he symbolized courage.
It's amazing how when we've had experiences ourselves, we're drawn to other people who have had those same experiences. Sometimes all it takes is to see somebody else who's done what we want to do to finally be inspired to decide, I'm going to do this and I'm going to take the risk of doing that. And the book in question, it's called That's Why I Wrote This Song, which I believe is currently out of print, but not to spoil anything, there's a possibility that in the future there may be a turn. Yeah.
Even if you can't get the book, you can go on YouTube and listen to the songs that drive this book.
Fantastic. I'll provide a link in the description of this episode to those songs. The topic we'd like to explore today is how children can be a force for good, given the work that you've done in that part of society's functioning. Now, as my regular audience will know, I'm always analysing and exploring how our minds work and why we think the way we do and why we develop the ideas that we do. And something else that I like to do as part of that is to challenge what we assume is true based on convention, but not necessarily based on objectivity. And one of the ideas that I'm very passionate about challenging, which I have done before and I'm going to continue to do so, is how significant children's minds are. And I've actually heard it even said that parents should stop taking children so seriously. We actually underestimate just how powerful children's minds are. As you were saying, Susan, it's an absolute fact that children understand concepts before they can communicate them using language or symbolism. All too often, we hear this viewpoint. I'm not sure if it's widespread, but it certainly exists that children can be little tyrants and they're just uncontrolled, dysregulated monsters. And unless we have a strong parenting hand to help raise them to be civilized, then they're inherently never going to be sociable or civilized. I remember when I was a child and I was being bullied, and my mother was often consoling me when I was quite affected by it. She said, "John, sometimes kids can be really nasty." In a literal sense, that may be true, but I strongly disagree with the sentiment. I have to say that while at that age, children are still learning to manage emotions, and therefore, if they don't learn to manage them in a healthy way, they can present themselves in a way that seems nasty. There are also plenty of children that are civilized and well behaved, and they don't necessarily come from the toughest parents. Often it's the parents that are wise enough to know how to balance discipline with love and compassion that end up raising the most civilized children, because those children learn to have a healthy sense of themselves. We now know it's a fact that children, when you really explore them and give them time, you'll quickly learn they do have a desire to grow, they do have a desire to learn, and they do have a desire to be as the world will accept them, not just in out of blind conformity, but they want to have a place in the world where they can feel as though they're doing something constructive. In your experience, what have you found to be the case in terms of how children can be a force for good? What do you think makes a child move in the direction of being positive rather than taking a negative path in life?
Adults that influence them. And I'm giving you a story. This little boy puts up his hand in one of my talks and he says, what happens if, mum and dad are fighting and dad throws a chair at mum and, the boy, who I don't know who he is, of course, it's the boy who's speaking, runs outside and takes the hand of his sister and hides behind a tree. And what I say to the boy is this: "Oh, you mean he's courageous?" Because his parents never want him to be afraid. But when they see their courageous son protect his sister and run into the background, you do what they want and what I admire. And really, by publicly stating that this boy who was telling me the story of a, inverted commas, coward, actually was telling me the story of a hero. And it changes their perspective. It does, because you're right, not all parents are warm and empathetic and the rest. We want to teach our children empathy, but children are very powerful. For example, we've run a 30-year campaign on no smoking, for example. The number of kids who will go up to their parents and see them smoking and will say, don't do that. They're the actual advisor. And parents feel that pressure. I think that the more teachers are aware of the impact of their words onto the kids, the more the kids develop empathy and change. Parents, of course, are the key guardians, the key models, and having an excellent role model is great, but they're not all excellent. They make mistakes like I do when I didn't notice my son, who I love more than my life, was bullied, came home with torn clothes. I didn't see it. I was so busy working and getting everything ready. We need to also learn about how we relate to our kids. Stop and listen.
Those are some excellent examples, Susan, of how children work with the world. There are a number of points you made that are quite exemplary, and the first is that the fact that the boy in your lecture implied that he may be seen as a coward for taking his sister's hand and running behind a tree when he saw these events take place. It's quite possible that he was never explicitly told that no one actually said to him, if you take your sister's hand and run behind a tree when you see your parents fighting and daddy gets upset and throws a chair, then you're a coward. In fact, I doubt that anyone actually said that specifically to him. But children have a fantastic ability, an amazing versatility to take what's in the world and then interpret it. Children don't take events on face value. They don't take ideas on face value. They tend to interpret it because their minds want to learn. They want to learn beyond what is immediately present in their vicinity. They want to learn, what can I do with the world that's not immediately here? And that's one of the reasons why we have to be so careful about, as you say, being attentive to them and really being willing to sit down with them and explain things. And that way, when they do see events take place in the world, they say, oh, I remember what mum and dad told me. When I see this, this is what it means and this is what I can do. And it also really stands to put us in the shoes of the child, that to any of us, standing up to someone who's doing the wrong thing may seem relatively routine, depending on who we are and what our lives involve. But to a child, that's incredibly scary. You have to remember that a child is quite vulnerable. They can't defend themselves, and if they see someone being violent, they don't know that the violence isn't going to be directed towards them.
I'm a firm believer if parents can, before a child goes to bed, it's a beautiful time. It's a time when you kiss them goodnight, but talk to them, tell them stories, let them talk to you. And often at that quiet time, they will express their real concerns. And you can travel with them to find out their solutions. For example, my son would say to me, I miss my grandpa. He said he never would leave me, and I can work it with him. He hasn't left you, but he has. No. Where is he? His spirit, you just can talk with them through their great issues. And their great issues are huge. Things like a parent leaving the house at night and the children are frightened they'll never return. They're frightened that a parent might die. What will happen to them? They're frightened of how to stand up when something like bullying occurs. Parents need to be there, but they need to know their child is developing personal belief that they can control a scary situation.
In our rather polarized society, it's important to have these types of discussions because when talking about how somebody can be a force for good, we tend to assume that what's good for us or what's good for society is necessarily the solution that's easiest or most comfortable. And something that I discuss quite frequently in my program and my discussions with others is how, from an evolutionary standpoint, we like to avoid discomfort because uncomfortable feelings are essentially our body and mind's way of signaling when there may be a threat. And often we react to the threats inside of us, the uncomfortable feelings, the same way that we react to the threats outside of us. When an internal threat occurs, an uncomfortable feeling, we tend to avoid it and we tend to do what we can to not let it affect us. Sometimes that, or quite often actually, that comes at the expense of growing. Sometimes, as you've described in your own journey, the only way to actually grow and seek a better outcome for yourself than what you would have otherwise had is to engage in the uncomfortable. And this is an area that's incredibly controversial, but it's important that we sift through the different views and come to some resolution as a society, because instances like that are ways of teaching children, yes, I've got your back, but I also have faith that it will also teach you in the future how to manage that yourself so that you don't withdraw from threats and allow those threats to overtake you, but at the same time you learn how to manage it.
Look, I agree. Always non-violence, discussion, that is the first port of call. But often in the real world, you have a choice: defend yourself or absorb the negative impact of feeling like nothing. Kids can feel like nothing and they take that on to the adult world. Look, I wrote the most beautiful picture book called The Boy in the Big Blue Glasses. And this boy is a joy, but he feels he stands out because he wears glasses. And all the adults are beautiful. Oh, you look handsome wearing those glasses. And the teacher says, you look so handsome. And the sister, everyone says, this boy looks great in his glasses. Inside, he's dying. He doesn't want to be different. And his teacher says, come out and everyone see his glasses. And he wants to hide under a rock. All the adults are being beautiful, but they're being wrong. They are undermining his key issue that he does not want to be different, because then he stands out for attack. Now, the worst thing in the world happens to the boy in the big blue glasses. His best friend doesn't come to school and he feels like really nothing. And all the kids are playing, having a great time. And this little boy sits in a box by himself. He says, they're all staring at me. No, they're not. But that's how he feels. I'm sort of alone. I'm scared. That's how he feels. No one knows what is happening in his mind. Don't worry, the story ends on a great and positive note where he does feel self-worth, and his glasses are part of his pirate outfit, and all is great and good.
When we talk about building resilience in children, teaching them to deal with the difficulties of the world, there is a fine line between helping them to develop that self-reliance and personal accountability and being cold. Nothing comes from nowhere. We can't just exist in the world and know everything that there is to know. And knowing how to deal with ourselves and work with our minds is not something that you're born knowing. We have the template for it, we have the machinery, but we don't have all of the skills to use it yet. We have to learn that through what we watch other people doing, especially our parents. One important point that I hear that story making is that it destigmatizes making mistakes, because we make them all the time, and we make a lot of mistakes about the world, including people are staring at me or people think negatively at me when it's a thought that we've developed that isn't reflected in the external world. There's no shame in making that mistake. Making mistakes and learning to reflect on them and ask, oh, I made a mistake. Why did I make that mistake? What can I do to avoid it in the future? But without any air of self-judgment is so important. Do the opposite and treat it as a positive. I made a mistake, but I learned something from it.
99% of young people, little or big, they have self-doubt, and it can be crippling. There's no question. And when I wrote this absolutely beautiful book called Butterflies, it's young adult, and it's about a girl when she was 3. It's based on a real girl. She experienced third-degree burns, and she had many years of hospitalisation. She lost her ear, half her hair, all down the side of her body, breast development, all that. And they mean when you lift your arm, you can tear your skin. It's a really confronting, horrible thing to go through. This wonderful girl, she is filled with self-doubt. Will people stare at me, calling her names? Will I get a boyfriend? I'm just too awful. Or, how can she achieve her dreams? This story inspires. I've had that many emails and messages, inspires mainly girls, I have to be honest, to say, I look at myself now in the mirror and know I will be all right because of what Catherine went through. I was invited by the Burn Congress in New York to fly to New York and speak at that Burn conference. And I said, yes, I would. Everyone lined up to get their books signed. And one girl, she was about 16 because of her voice. She was young. She had a total face reconstruction because of the burns. And she holds butterflies to her heart. And she says to me, will I have a life? And I said, I promise you will have a life.
What a beautiful story, Susan. It again stands as such a shining example that we are a social species and there is so much good to be done, but we have to develop virtue through experience. And there is so much that we can't know without experience, and there's so much that we can't know after just having been born into the world. We have to learn to relate to ourselves as much as we learn to relate to other people. They really need to start with the idea that they are capable of it and that it's worthwhile. And again, persistently we see in different people in our different endeavors, me working with people every day, that if you don't hold those ideas to be true, then all the capability in the world can't solve it. We often don't realize that our minds do have a lot of control over us. And if we learn to recognize it and learn to recognize, I am worth putting in the effort to grow, in and of itself, that is a necessary basis. We need it. In any case, you can be compassionate with children while at the same time seeing the opportunity to help them grow by helping them face the challenge. When they're facing the challenge, if they feel like backing down, you're spiritually saying to them, don't worry, I have you if you fall, but just keep going and you have this.
One thing children and adults need, they need to have tolerance for themselves. Sometimes I doubt myself, really. I feel I do nothing or I've not pursued the goal. I need to get my energy back. It's okay to have self-doubt. as long as it doesn't become the dominant personality trait. You must have it, because also we don't learn unless we have self-doubt. We don't experience courage unless we know we have to fight self-doubt.
Indeed, and when children and adults stand as allies, then they help each other and amongst their respective groups. Adults learn to understand children, children develop confidence in themselves, and then they influence other children to have confidence in themselves too. And the Mabasta movement is just one example of how children are having a positive influence on one another because they see in other people the virtue and the ideas that they can't quite understand themselves, because sometimes it takes an external perspective to be able to provide that. And when they see that, they realize, this is what I can do to be virtuous. Now, inevitably in this whole journey, when we're parenting children, there comes a time when we have to also hold children accountable, because if they, as you say, if they don't learn those skills and those virtues as a child, then they will lack it as an adult. And there's a constant battle, a culture war of sorts, between two polarities. One side who says that children should be punished, including with spanking, as a means of holding them accountable, and the other side that says that we shouldn't punish at all and that we don't use anything that could remotely be construed as negativity as a way of holding children accountable. Now, I've been quite vocal about saying that you shouldn't use physical discipline on children ever. There is never a reason to. How do we balance compassion and being age appropriate with accountability? It's something, it's such a difficult balance. What have you seen in life and what have you personally done that you find speaks to that?
I don't believe in physical punishment ever for any reason, but children are smart. They know when they're younger, they test you. You don't respond by one, telling them the same thing again and again, because they know. So, for example, if they decide to throw a vase on the ground and it breaks, you will react. And you react by doing something. Give them a brush and a pan, and they pick it up. And you say, why did you do that? They don't know. You say that, it destroys something or whatever, but you give them something to do to feel good about it. And at the end, they said, I'm sorry. And then you hug them. So it's really a matter of consequences. What you aim to do is throw the responsibility and the resolutions to the kids and then support it. But the really main issue is that they need to be empowered to make their own decisions and mistakes. Like Catherine in Butterflies, she feels angry inside that she's not recognized by her best friend who she loves for, her challenges and burns. And the best friend wants to make her feel better and said, look, I've got a scar on my lip. And she looks at it. It's the tiniest scar she's ever seen. And it disempowers her. It makes her go internally and feel anger. But she doesn't show that anger to the girl. She works it out and she comes up with a healing solution. One day when she sees the girl, she said, that hurt me because I have major challenges, and you trivialized it. She worked out her solution: anger, thinking, confronting, and then she's empowered.
And you spoke to a number of different situations there that were really important, and I can speak to this from both a personal and a professional perspective. Professionally, I've worked with children and adults who may have had intellectual disabilities or had autism spectrum disorder, who were impeded in their ability to communicate and regulate their own emotions. To this day, I still do work with some other professionals who are doing the same, given that I mainly work with adults now in my own practice. But what we've learned over time is that, especially children, when they're still functioning in a more basic way cognitively, is that whether they're of sound mind or whether they may have a mental illness, behaviors all have a purpose. They always tend to do something for a reason, even if they can't articulate why it is that they're doing what they're doing. Now, a child who might have an intellectual disability or might be autistic, the introduction of consequences into those interactions has to be a lot more careful and a lot more restrained, because that child is far less able to comprehend the consequences of their actions than any other child would be. And so it's inhumane to punish them, because what people often don't realize, and I've spoken about this on my program before, is that when children in that position have what we call a meltdown, what they're actually doing is trying to find a way to communicate their needs. And because they know what their needs are, but they can't find a way to communicate it because their brain doesn't allow it, they use whatever they feel is going to be effective to get the attention of someone they know they can help them, an adult mostly. So at a very basic level, that's them trying to survive. We know that they're safe in our care, but they don't know that, and we take for granted just how important that safety is. A child who isn't affected that way, their behaviours still have a function, and if a child drops a vase, there may be a reason why they did it, not necessarily a legitimate reason, but they may still have had a reason. Perhaps they were trying to get someone's attention.
Yeah.
Now,
Mainly.
in those situations, mainly, probably, and getting attention is one of the main reasons that children enact behaviours that we consider misbehaviours, because they want to get our attention, but perhaps for some reason they've interpreted that that's the best way to do it. I would argue, and again, I'm not a parent myself, and I've worked with plenty of parents before. I've had different experiences with research and different parents' experiences. So I'm tentatively concluding at this stage in my journey that consequences are important. Sometimes exposing children to negative consequences that aren't harmful but still might be uncomfortable is a necessary part of growth. It just has to be tempered. And a good example might be taking away pocket money. If you're a child, your parents are not, if you're good parents, you're not going to let your child starve or go without anything that they need. So they don't necessarily need that money to survive. But it sets an example for them in the future. If you do this when I'm not here to look after you, then things that may actually affect your ability to survive may happen. So learn to do the right thing now so that in the future you don't potentially put yourself or your family in jeopardy. So we have to be wise about it. We have to be thinkers.
Story is one of the most useful ways for kids and adults to gain empathy. They're not presented with being I am Jack or anything. They're not presented with a instructive lesson. You don't know, as you open the book, I'm going to read about bullying. You don't know. You get engaged in the characters, they become you, and then you go on the journey, and at the end, you learn something about yourself. So I think books, story, Audible, especially with children who have some sort of disability, Audible's fine. I think story is one of the most successful ways of getting into character, finding yourself, good or bad, and then changing. I spoke at a school with very strong disabilities. I've never seen so many disabilities in one place. It was on North Rocks in Sydney. So I went there and I spoke to each group. One group was a group of teenagers, 14 to 16, 17, and they were in wheelchairs and some were emotionally dysfunctional and all sorts of disabilities. And I spoke to them about a picture book. It was actually called Gracie and Josh, and I spoke to them and told them the story. There was one boy there. He was in a wheelchair, and he actually could say, after all the education never and everything, 3 words. That's all his communication was. He was very disabled, and his carer was there. At the end of the story, which I told the children, this boy, this 16-year-old, went like this, which is pumping his chest like that. The carer came up to me and said, "You know what he's saying?" And I said, "No." More story. More story.
Indeed, we learn so much by relating to other people through story or in real life. And we are designed by nature to relate to other people. Other people help us not just to survive at a basic level, but they help us grow because they teach us ideas from their own lives and through the way that they communicate with us that would be difficult or impossible for us to learn just through introspection. And so stories are such an important way, also because they help to make certain ideas more understandable for children. They make them practical. Abstract reasoning doesn't develop until a little bit later in childhood. So if you can provide a child with a concrete scenario that they can imagine themselves being involved in, then they can so much more easily understand, how does this idea apply to me? What can I do to be involved in it? Never assume what or who someone is just based on what you see. There's a lot we can do that we may not even realize until it happens. I think that speaks to a final point that is really important in helping to connect with children, because in order to help children develop virtue, we have to connect with them and show them the virtue of itself. I've spoken before about children's speakers, and a lot of us have been to schools in the past in which we have been exposed to motivational speakers and public speakers who aim their content at children or teenagers. And something I've often observed is, I think a lot of the approaches that these facilitators take don't acknowledge just how much the children know. They try to be children for the children, but then the children see that. And again, I'm not a child myself, so it's hard for me to reflect on it, and I wasn't necessarily a typical child, so it's hard for me to reflect on it objectively, but I can't help but intuit and put myself in the minds of these children and think that these children must be thinking, why are you telling me this? I already know this. I already know how to be a child. But that they would respond so much more effectively to someone who's being a role model to them and taking them seriously and speaking to them, not in a way that's not understandable, but in a way that shows them, I'm going to treat you like someone who's going to grow up into an adult one day and be able to understand this, and I'm going to help you understand this from now so that you can grow with us. Is that something that you find in your own speaking? And I imagine that a lot of the approach that you take to communicating with young audiences involve you showing them things and being a role model for them, not trying to be them.
When I speak to, and sometimes thousands of kids and adults, the kids believe that I am speaking directly to them. That's what they think. And they come back, and if they come, which they often do at the end, they think I've spoken only to them. That is something really important when I speak. I don't want to speak in cliches or instructional text. I don't want to. I want to speak to them about the things that matter to them, and they think about the responses that they give. I always use story. So when you start, you don't start with a normal adult presentation, which is always boring. I try, if they introduce me, I beg them, do not give a huge blurb about me, because one, the kids have already left the scene. I said, don't. And I start with story as the first point of call. So maybe say Jack, because we've talked about Jack. I might start with saying Jack is the best kid out, just like you. And then I, say all the great things. He plays soccer, he swims, but he's very annoying. They all laugh. He especially annoys his sister. How many of you kids like to annoy your brother or sister? They all put up that's their job. I said, oh, well, my son, he started with a very important experiment. He was putting a potato and an onion together, and they got their interest. And he came up to his mum and he said, I am going to make a new vegetable to feed the world. And of course, mum says, good thinking, and also become very rich. And they laugh. And then, stuff happens. But I start really with humour. That is something that captures the audience, humour. And then go into the more serious matters. Ask them to participate, At the end, if they trust me, and often they do trust me, and they give their beautiful little stories, but they're big stories. But the most important thing I do is I am an accessible person, and they know pretty well straight away that I'm their friend. I'm on their side. And then they come. I've had adults come up to me afterwards and they said, I didn't know that I was destroying another kid, because they're on their own self-centered journey of trying to have a presence and be a star, whatever. And this woman, she was in her 30s, said, I bullied a girl mercilessly. And she said, I saw her the other day and I went up to her and I apologized. I said, I wish I hadn't ever done it. Now, for the girl she had destroyed, that may mean something to her, like she's seeking forgiveness. I don't know. But for her to apologize shows growth.
We can all miss things in our life that grow into bigger problems. What's important is that we recognize that those things have taken place, that we own them, that we accept responsibility, and that we take action to correct what we've done. And we have to all believe we're worth the growth. Susan, this has been an absolutely fantastic discussion. I'm going to place the link to Susan's website in the description of this episode, and I very much encourage everyone, especially those of you who have young readers in your life, to go and look at Susan's literature, because there are fantastic stories to be told and lessons to be learned. Susan, it's been an absolute pleasure having you here. Thank you for coming onto the program. Do you have a message for our audience before we finish today?
Young people and old, have the capacity to create a better world, and let's keep that front of mind, because I want everyone to seek their own happiness.
Thank you, Susan. I concur. And to our audience, thank you to everyone for joining us today. As I always say, never take what you find in the media or on the internet as advice. If you have concerns about yourself or someone else, please seek the advice of a professional. And if you have any ideas about what you'd like to hear on the program, if you'd like to be a guest, if you'd like to challenge me or have any feedback, please send it through. I love to hear from my audience. And Susan, if audience members want to contact you via your website, is that okay?
Yep.
Excellent.
I will answer.
Well, thank you to everybody for joining us, and until next time, take care.